The phone rang at exactly 2 in the morning, and in that first shrill note I already knew whose name would be on the screen before I even looked. I set down the loop I'd been holding over a stranger's antique wristwatch, the gears still ticking under the bright little lamp on my workbench, and I picked up on the second ring. "Can we go relive our memories?" Jessica said before I'd even said hello. "Just once more before everything changes. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 32 years old, and I repair watches for a living, the kind of work that punishes impatience and rewards people who know how to sit with a problem until it finally gives up its secret. I inherited the shop from my grandfather, along with his workbench, his tools, and I suspect his habit of saying very little and meaning most of it. Most mornings look the same for me. I unlock the front door of Turner's Watch and Clock at 7, before the rest of 5th Street wakes up. I make coffee in the same chipped blue mug my grandfather used. Black, no sugar, and I sit at the bench where the morning light falls best for close work. I like the sound of 40 clocks ticking slightly out of sync with each other, like a room full of people breathing. For 2 years now, since Rachel and I signed the last of the papers, that sound has been the closest thing I have to company before 9 a.m. Rachel and I didn't end in some dramatic collapse. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no discovery that blew the roof off the house. We ended the way a clock runs down when nobody remembers to wind it, slowly, quietly, until one day you notice it stopped and you can't say exactly when. She wanted dinners out, parties, a life that moved. I wanted Tuesday nights on the porch and a shop that smelled like oil and brass. Somewhere in our 4th year of marriage, she started calling that smallness, and I stopped arguing that it wasn't. By the time we sat across from a lawyer's desk, we were already strangers who happened to share a mortgage. Jessica was the only person who didn't disappear when the marriage did. She and I have known each other since we were 12, since the summer her family moved into the yellow house next to mine on Larkspur Street, back when Eugene still felt like a town instead of a city. Somewhere along the way, she became the person I measured every other friendship against. When I met Rachel in college, Jessica was the one who liked her first, who stood at the altar in a pale green dress and cried before I did. She was maid of honor at a wedding that would end 8 years later. She was also, if I'm honest with myself, the one person I never quite stopped watching from the corner of my eye, even on that day. "Jess, it's 2 in the morning, I said, glancing at the clock above my register, an old railroad piece that has kept perfect time since 1954. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, and I could hear, and underneath the words, that it wasn't entirely. I just couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about the wedding and the guest list, and David's mother's opinions about napkin colors, and I wanted to think about something that was actually mine for a minute. David is a good man. I want to say that plainly, because nothing about what happened later erases it. He's an architect, 33, steady in the way people are when they've never had to fight very hard for anything. He proposed to Jessica 8 months ago on a hike above Spencer Butte, and when she called to tell me, I said all the right things, right? And I meant most of them. "What did you have in mind?" I asked her. "The places," she said. "All of them. The creek behind my parents' old house, the diner where we used to split one plate of fries because neither of us had money, the flea market where we found that stupid watch. I want to see all of it again before I'm somebody's wife and this version of me sort of stops existing. Will you come with me? Before I run out of time to remember who I was before I became someone's missus?" I should have said no, but there was something in her voice, thinner than usual, worn at the edges, that made refusing feel like a small cruelty I wasn't willing to commit. 3 weeks isn't much time," I said instead. "It's enough for what I'm asking," she said. "It's just memories, Michael. Not a crime." I laughed, but it didn't sit easy in my chest, because we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Some memories you can visit like an old house with the furniture still inside, and some you keep locked because you're not sure the floor will hold if you walk back in. She came by the shop the next afternoon, wearing her father's old canvas jacket against the first cold snap of the season, maple leaves stuck to her boots. I was sorting a box of estate sale watches nobody had claimed in a decade when the bell over the door announced her. "You still keep that door propped with a brick," she said. "Some things don't need fixing," I said. She smiled, the kind that used to make me feel like the only interesting person in a room. And for a second, the 8 years since we were kids folded up small enough to fit in my pocket. We started small that first week. The diner on Willamette Street, where the woman behind the counter still remembered Jessica's order from a decade ago, and the porch of her childhood home, now owned by a family with 2 dogs and a trampoline where her mother's rose bushes used to be. We didn't talk about David, and we didn't talk about Rachel at all. We talked about the years in between, and somewhere in that ordinary talk I noticed myself relaxing into a version of quiet I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. It became a routine within days, the way things do when neither person names what's happening. She'd show up around 4 after her shift downtown, and we'd walk somewhere on her list before the light went. She started leaving her jacket on the hook by my door instead of carrying it home. I started making 2 cups of coffee out of habit. Even on days she wasn't coming by and pouring the second one out, embarrassed at myself. On the 5th day, we went to the creek behind what used to be her parents' place. The water was low with autumn, and we sat on the same flat rock we'd claimed as kids, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched every time one of us shifted to skip a stone. Jessica went quiet partway through, staring at the water longer than the moment seemed to need. "Do you ever wonder," she said finally, "if we stopped some things too early? Just to be safe?" I told her I didn't know what she meant, which wasn't entirely a lie and wasn't entirely the truth either. She let it drop, the way you let a stone sink instead of skipping it, and we walked back as the streetlights came on along a road neither of us had lived on in 15 years. By the 2nd week, her presence in my days had stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like weather, expected, absorbed into the shape of things. She knew which mug in my cabinet was chipped and always chose it, saying broken things suited her better anyway. Neither of us called any of it what it was. We called it memories, because that word came with permission the other one didn't. I noticed the clasp on her watch was loose on a Thursday, the gold hinge worn almost through from 20 years on the same wrist. I didn't say anything. I just took it home that night and stayed up past midnight resetting the pin until it closed with a small, certain click, then left it on the counter the next morning without a note. She noticed before she said a word of thanks. I watched her fingers find it fixed and go still. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," I said, and didn't offer anything else because there are repairs a man makes because he can, and repairs he makes because leaving something broken has started to feel unbearable, and I wasn't ready to say out loud which one this was. On the 9th day, she asked about the flea market. "The one out past the fairgrounds," she said. "It's not there anymore, is it?" "Torn down 2 years ago," I said. "Storage units now." "That's where we found it," she said. "The watch." I went to the back room and came out with it wrapped in the soft cloth I use for pieces too fragile to trust to a drawer. A small brass pocket watch, dulled with age. The crystal scratched in a crescent across one corner. Jessica had bought it for me the summer we turned 12, with $3 of allowance money and a look on her face like she was handing me something sacred. It had stopped running before either of us was born. And in 19 years of taking apart other people's broken time for a living, I have never once managed to make this particular watch move past 4 minutes before it seizes and goes still again. "You still have it," she said, and there was something unsteady in her voice that hadn't been there in the diner or on the porch. "I have all of it," I said, before I could decide whether that was wise to say out loud. She looked up at me then, and it lasted a second too long. Long enough that I felt my own pulse do something complicated. Long enough that the shop, with its 40 ticking clocks, went strangely quiet, as if even the mechanisms sensed they should mind their business. "Michael," she said softer than before, "there's something about that summer I never told you." The bell over my door rang before she could say another word, caught by a gust of wind, and by the time I turned back, whatever she had been about to say had folded itself shut again, tucked away like the watch back into its cloth. "It's nothing," she said too quickly, reaching for her jacket. Forget I said anything. I wanted to tell her I couldn't, that I had spent 19 years learning how to listen for the exact moment a mechanism was about to give, and that she had just made that sound. Instead, I wrapped the watch back in its cloth and set it on the counter between us, where it sat all evening like something neither of us was willing to pick up first. She left a little after 6, standing in the doorway with the cold coming in around her the way it does right before winter commits to itself. For a second, 1 second, long enough to notice and too short to be sure of, her eyes dropped to my mouth and back up again. And neither of us moved, and neither of us said the thing that would have made the moment mean something we couldn't take back. Then she was gone, boots crunching over the first fallen leaves, and I stood alone in a shop full of clocks, all disagreeing gently about what time it actually was. I didn't sleep well that night, and it wasn't the wind. It was the watch, sitting on my nightstand where I'd carried it without deciding to, ticking for exactly 4 minutes before it stopped, the way it always had, the way it always would, as if some things were built only to almost work, and nobody had ever bothered asking why. My father still comes by the shop on Wednesdays, out of habit more than need, and that Wednesday he found Jessica's scarf draped over the chair by the window before he found me in the back room. "Someone's been keeping you company," Walter Turner said, holding the scarf up like evidence, though there was no accusation in it. Only the particular amusement of a man who has outlived most of his own secrets. "She's revisiting some old places before the wedding," I said. "I'm just along for it." My father has a way of looking at a person that used to unnerve customers who tried to haggle over a repair estimate. He turned that look on me for a moment, then set the scarf down exactly where he'd found it. "Your mother used to leave her gloves everywhere," he said. "Car, church pew, my truck. I used to think she was careless. Took me about 11 years to understand she just liked leaving pieces of herself in the places she wanted to come back to." He didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't ask him to. That's the shape our conversations have taken since my mother died. Small observations set down gently, like tools returned to their proper hooks, never forced into a bigger point than they needed to make. The days with Jessica had stopped being occasions and become something closer to a shared life running quietly alongside my actual one. She took to sitting in the back room some afternoons with a book while I worked, not needing conversation to justify being there, and I found I didn't need it either. Her boots collected by my door next to mine. I bought a second chair for the workbench without discussing it with anyone, including myself, until it was already assembled. One Saturday we drove out to the old fairgrounds anyway, storage units or not, and stood in the gravel lot where the flea market used to sprawl every third weekend of the month. The vendor stalls were gone, replaced by rows of orange roll-up doors, and somehow that made it worse. The way it is always worse to see a memory paved over than simply erased. Jessica walked the length of what used to be the main row, counting off booths that no longer existed by muscle memory alone. The woman who sold dented tin toys, the man who only bought and sold pocket watches, the folding table where a 12-year-old girl had once handed a 12-year-old boy $3 in exchange for something neither of them understood they were really buying. Neither of us said much. She reached over at one point and straightened the collar of my jacket. A small, unthinking gesture, the kind you only make for someone you've stopped being careful around, and neither of us mentioned it. And neither of us moved away either. We didn't talk about the moment the bell had interrupted. Back in my shop, we built an entire week around not talking about it, which is its own kind of conversation if you've ever tried to have one. I noticed that same week that she went quiet every time David's name came up in passing, a half-second longer than a happy woman planning her wedding should need. I told myself it was nerves. I have gotten very good at telling myself things. Then Rachel called. I hadn't heard her voice in 4 months, since the last logistical email about a storage unit we'd finally emptied. She didn't bother with hello. "Someone told my sister you've been spending a lot of time with Jessica Hale," she said. "At the shop, around town, before her wedding, Michael. Does that not strike you as strange?" "She's getting married in 3 weeks," I said. "I'm helping her revisit some places before she does. That's all it is." "Right," Rachel said, and the word carried more weight than a single syllable should be able to hold. "You know, I used to lie awake wondering if I was imagining it. The way you two were around each other, even at our wedding. I told myself for years I was just insecure, Turns out I just had good instincts. I want to say I felt defensive, righteous, anything cleaner than what I actually felt, which was exposed. The way a gear feels when you finally pull the case off and expose the whole mechanism to light it was never built to sit in. Nothing happened, Rachel. Something happened, she said, quieter now, all the sharpness drained out of it. I don't know what you'd call it, but something happened and I knew it. And I stayed married to you for 5 more years anyway, and I'd like you to at least have the decency not to lie to me about it now that it doesn't cost either of us anything. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked her, and it came out rougher than I meant it to. Because saying it out loud would have made it real, she said. And I wanted our marriage to survive more than I wanted to be right. Turns out you can't build a house on top of a thing you're both pretending isn't there. I found that out the hard way, and so, apparently, did you. We spend so much of our lives believing our silences are private. Hers had been sitting right next to mine the entire time, occupying the same house, and I had never once noticed the shape of it. I did not tell Rachel about that night in detail, because some doors, once you open them, cannot be closed on someone else's terms. But I called Jessica after, and I told her Rachel knew and had known, and that changed something in the air between us that had been holding steady for 2 weeks. She came to the shop that evening instead of the next afternoon, and for the first time since this whole strange season of revisiting began, she didn't ask to go anywhere. She sat in the second chair at my bench and was quiet long enough that the 40 clocks filled in the silence for both of us. I have replayed that August night more times than I've admitted to anyone, including myself. The version I tell is careful: a summer storm, a stalled car, 1 candle because the power had gone. What I never say is that I drove 40 minutes with the radio off, rehearsing what I would tell him, and that somewhere between his porch light and his hands I forgot every word of it. That summer, she said finally, I came to your house to tell you something. Not what almost happened. Before that, I was going to tell you that Rachel had been distant with everyone, that something was wrong, that you should ask her directly instead of working longer hours to avoid the quiet at home. I remember the storm, I said. I don't remember you saying any of that. Because I never said it, Jessica said. Because the second I was standing in front of you, all of that felt smaller than what I actually wanted to say, and I got scared, and neither of us said the right thing, and I left before either of us could say the wrong one all the way to the end. Silence is just love that never learned how to introduce itself. I've turned that sentence over more times since than I can count because I think it's the truest thing either of us said all autumn. And afterward, I asked. Afterward, I stopped calling as much, she said. I told myself I was giving your marriage room to breathe. Really, I was giving myself room to stop feeling what I was feeling. I didn't know it would take the air out of the house the way it did. I didn't know silence could do that much damage from that far outside a marriage. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it the way I'd turn an unfamiliar mechanism, looking for the point where the blame was supposed to click into place. I couldn't find it. There wasn't a villain in the story she'd just told me, only 2 people who had each taken a small human step backward at the exact same moment and left a marriage standing empty in the space where they used to stand. I'm not angry, I told her, and meant it, which surprised us both. I know, she said, that's almost worse. I called Rachel back 2 nights later, not to apologize because I'd decided somewhere in the space between the shop and my truck that I didn't owe an apology for a thing that never became what she feared it had. I told her the truth, plainly, the way I'd want a customer to tell me exactly what was wrong with a watch instead of describing everything around the problem. What happened, when and why it stopped where it did. She was quiet on the other end for a while. Thank you for finally just saying it, she said. It's strange. I think I just needed to hear it out loud once from you before I could stop carrying it around. That was the last conversation we've had. My father, when I told him a shortened version over coffee that weekend, didn't offer advice. He just nodded slowly, the way he does when a customer describes a sound their watch has started making that they can't quite name. Your mother and I almost didn't make it past our 2nd year, he said, apropos of nothing I'd asked. Different reasons than yours. But I remember thinking the marriage was over, and then realizing it wasn't the marriage that needed fixing so much as the two people inside it, learning to say things out loud instead of just enduring them quietly. Some people never learn that. Some people learn it 40 years too late to matter. You're neither of those yet. The wedding happened on a bright, cold Saturday 3 weeks later, exactly on schedule, in a barn outside town strung with lights against the early dark. I stood near the back in a borrowed jacket and watched Jessica marry a good man who had never once made her feel like something to be solved. I meant every ounce of the applause I gave them, and I meant it the way you mean applause for something you're genuinely glad happened, even when a small private corner of you goes quiet for the length of a song. 3 months after that, the leaves were long gone from Larkspur Street, and my phone had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace than like a held breath. When an envelope arrived at the shop with no return address and my name written in handwriting, I would have known blind, in the dark, after 20 years. I turned it over twice, studying the handwriting like it was a mechanism I could diagnose just by looking at the case. 3 months of quiet and then this. Waiting on my counter like it had been sitting somewhere patient the entire time, the way certain letters seem to know exactly when a person is finally steady enough to receive them. I didn't open it that night. I set it on the counter next to the pocket watch, 2 small unresolved things sitting side by side. And I stood there a long time before I turned off the lights, trying to decide which one of them I was more afraid of finally winding. 3 days after the envelope arrived, I finally opened it. Inside was a single page in Jessica's handwriting, dated the morning of her wedding and a small brass key taped to the corner. The kind that belongs to something too small to be important and too locked to be ignored. Michael, if you're reading this, it means I finally did the thing I've been too much of a coward to do for 20 years, which is let you actually see me. There's a storage unit at Baxter Self-Storage, Unit 114. Inside is everything I never sent you. I'm not asking you to do anything with it except know it existed. I hope the watch finally runs someday. I hope I get to hear about it secondhand, the way people hear about the good things that happened to someone they used to love out loud. Jay, I drove to Baxter Self-Storage that same afternoon. The key heavier in my pocket than a piece of brass had any right to be, and I sat in my truck in the gravel lot for 11 minutes before I made myself walk to the door. Unit 114 held 4 cardboard boxes, each labeled by year in Jessica's handwriting, going back to the summer we turned 12. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some finished, some half a page and abandoned mid-sentence, spanning 2 decades of a life she'd apparently been narrating to me the entire time without my knowledge, the way some people keep a diary, and others, it turns out, keep a person. The oldest one, written the year we turned 14, was 3 sentences long in handwriting still rounded with childhood. I like you the way you like a song you're embarrassed to admit you play on repeat. I'm never going to tell you this. Writing it down is as far as I'll let it go. Another, dated the week of my wedding to Rachel, was longer and harder to read in the dimming light of that storage unit. I told everyone I was crying because weddings make me cry. That's true. It's also not the whole truth. I am going to stand up there and mean every word of my toast, because you deserve someone who chose you loudly, and I have only ever loved you quietly, and quiet doesn't get to complain when loud wins. The one from the night of the storm said what she'd never managed to say out loud in my shop months earlier. Not just that she'd come to warn me about Rachel's distance, but that she had loved me since we were 16, deliberately choosing again and again not to say it because she'd watched what wanting things loudly had done to her own parents' marriage. And she'd rather love someone in silence than lose them in an argument about who deserved to be loved first. There was one more, tucked in an envelope by itself at the bottom of the last box, dated only 3 months earlier. Written, I realized, the same week she'd mailed me the key. I used to think love that doesn't get spoken out loud just disappears eventually. Wears down like a coin passed through too many hands. It doesn't. It just goes quiet and keeps existing anyway underneath everything else you build. I'm not writing this to change anything. David is my whole life now, and I mean that completely. I'm writing it because I finally understood that a truth you never speak still costs you something every single day you don't speak it. And I didn't want to keep paying that particular bill in secret anymore. The last one in the box, dated the morning of her own engagement to David, was shorter and somehow harder than all the others. He is going to be a good husband. I am going to be a good wife. And somewhere in me, quietly, permanently, there is a 12-year-old girl standing at a flea market handing a boy a watch who never got to grow up and say what she meant. I'm going to let her rest now. I hope you'll let your version of that summer rest too, eventually. Not because it didn't matter. Because it mattered enough to finally put down. I sat in that storage unit until the manager knocked twice on the metal door to tell me closing time had passed 20 minutes ago, and I hadn't noticed the light going from orange to gray to nothing at all. I drove home with all 4 boxes in the bed of my truck and didn't sleep. Not out of grief exactly, but out of the strange, disorienting fullness of finding out that an entire second history had been running quietly alongside the one I thought I knew. The way a watch keeps time inside a case you never bother to open. A month after that afternoon on the concrete floor of a storage unit, I drove out to my father's place on a Sunday and told him about the boxes, leaving out most of the specifics and keeping all of the shape. He listened the way he listens to a customer describe a sound their watch has started making, without interrupting. And when I finished, he was quiet for longer than I expected. "Your mother wrote me letters too before we married," he said. "Never sent half of them. Found them in a shoebox after she passed. Nearly broke me all over again reading things she never said out loud when she had the chance." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "You don't get to go back and answer any of it, son. You just get to carry it differently now that you know it was there." "How do you carry it?" "Then?" I asked him. "Same way you carry anything heavy and irreplaceable," he said. "Careful and out in the open instead of hidden somewhere you'll forget to check on it. Your mother's shoebox sits on my dresser now. I don't open it every day, but I know exactly where it is, and that's different than pretending it doesn't exist." He looked at me the way he used to look at a repair estimate he suspected I was about to lowball. "Jessica gave you a key, Michael. Not to her. To something you'd both been keeping locked. That's not nothing. Don't waste it by deciding it means less than it does, and don't waste it by deciding it means more than it does either." 1 year after that afternoon in the storage unit, I ran into Jessica and David at the farmer's market on 8th Street. The 3 of us managing an easy, unremarkable conversation about pie crusts and the price of local honey, and it didn't cost either of us anything. David asked me, unprompted and without a trace of suspicion in it, whether I'd ever gotten that old pocket watch running, and something in the ordinary kindness of the question told me everything I needed to know about how little there was left to hide. Jessica hugged me goodbye the way you hug an old friend, brief and warm and entirely without static. And I understood, standing in that parking lot, that whatever we had built and dismantled between us had finally found its proper shape. Not a marriage, not a secret, just 2 people who had once been each other's whole world and had learned, slowly, how to let that be enough without needing it to become something else. A customer came through my shop that same season, a woman passing through on her way back to Ashford, Ohio, dropping off a wristwatch that had belonged to her late husband. She mentioned, almost in passing, a carpenter back home who still kept a crib in his garage that he'd built years before and never had the chance to use. And I thought about how many of us are out here quietly keeping some version of an unused thing, waiting for it to mean something different than it once did. 2 years after the night I first opened that envelope, on a Tuesday that started like any other, I sat down at my bench with my grandfather's tools and Jessica's 12-year-old pocket watch. And I did something I'd never let myself try before. I didn't attempt to force the mechanism the way I always had, the way I'd forced it 100 times across 19 years, always the same 4 minutes before it seized. I cleaned it slower than I'd ever cleaned anything, replaced a single hairspring I'd been too afraid to touch in case I broke whatever was left of it, and wound it once gently, the way you'd wind something that had finally earned the right to be handled with patience instead of urgency. It ran past 4 minutes. It ran past an hour. By that evening, it was still running, keeping time as steadily as anything else in my shop, as if it had simply been waiting 19 years for someone patient enough to stop being afraid of what fixing it might actually mean. I called Jessica that night, not to tell her anything about us because there was nothing left unsaid between us that needed saying anymore. I told her the watch was running. She was quiet on the line for a moment, and then she laughed, the good kind, The kind that used to make me feel like the only interesting person in a room, and said she always knew I'd get there eventually. I just needed the right 19 years. Can we go relive our memories? She'd asked me once at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks before her wedding, and I understand now that she wasn't asking me to go backward at all. She was asking permission to finally put something down that we'd both been carrying too carefully for too long, so that we could each walk forward without it weighing exactly the same amount in both our hands. I've learned this much, in a shop full of clocks that never quite agree with each other on what time it actually is. The people who know us longest are rarely the people we're allowed to keep, and the bravest thing we ever do isn't falling in love. It's telling the truth about it out loud. Even years too late, even when the only thing left to do with that truth is finally let it rest. My father taught me that patience fixes more than force ever does. Jessica taught me that some love is real, even when it never gets to become the whole story. And the watch running quietly on my nightstand now taught me that some things were never broken at all. They were only waiting for someone brave enough to stop rushing them. If there's someone in your life you've been loving in silence, or someone who loved you that way once without your ever knowing it, send them this today. Sometimes the kindest thing we can give another person is the truth, even after it can no longer change anything between us, especially then. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like Michael and Jessica's, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever kept a truth quiet to protect someone you loved, and looking back, do you wish you hadn't?